You've probably heard "you are what you eat" as a throwaway phrase, something printed on a gym poster. For predator meat, it's not a metaphor. It's closer to a literal warning. Every animal a predator has ever eaten, and everything toxic that passed through those animals along the way, ends up concentrated in the predator's own tissue by the time it dies. Eating that predator means eating the accumulated leftovers of everything it ever hunted. And that's only the first problem. Here's the thing nobody tells you. Almost every human culture that has ever existed, independently, arrived at the same rule. Eat the deer, eat the cow, eat the rabbit, don't eat the wolf, the lion, the bear. Not squeamishness, not superstition dressed up as tradition. There's real biology buried underneath that rule, and it's stranger and more mechanical than predator meat tastes bad. So let's actually take this apart properly, because there isn't one single reason. There are at least 4, stacked on top of each other, and together they explain why this taboo shows up on every inhabited continent. Let's start with the one most people have never heard of: biomagnification. Here's how it works. A toxin, a heavy metal, a pesticide, an industrial pollutant enters an ecosystem in tiny, often harmless concentrations. Plankton absorb trace amounts. A small fish eats thousands of plankton, and that toxin doesn't just pass through, it accumulates in the fish's tissue, particularly its fat. A bigger fish eats hundreds of those small fish, and now the concentration has climbed again. A shark eats dozens of those bigger fish over its lifetime, and the toxin keeps stacking, layer on layer, because the body has no efficient way to flush it back out. By the time you reach the top of that food chain, the concentration of toxin in the apex predator's tissue can be millions of times higher than the concentration in the water it started in. That's not a hypothetical. It's why modern health agencies issue mercury advisories specifically for shark, swordfish, and king mackerel, and specifically warn pregnant women away from them, while giving essentially no such warning for herbivorous or low trophic level fish like sardines or tilapia. The mercury doesn't come from the shark. It comes from everything the shark ever ate, concentrated and locked into its flesh. This isn't limited to mercury either. The clearest historical proof of biomagnification in action comes from DDT, the pesticide sprayed across American farmland through the 1940s and 50s. DDT itself was applied at relatively low concentrations, diluted across enormous fields, but it didn't break down. It moved into insects, into the small birds and fish that ate those insects, and then into the apex predators sitting at the very top of those food chains: bald eagles, peregrine falcons, ospreys. By the time DDT reached those birds, it had magnified so dramatically that it interfered with calcium metabolism, causing eggshells to thin to the point of crushing under the weight of the incubating parent. Bald eagle populations in the continental United States collapsed by an estimated 90% before DDT was banned in 1972. Nobody sprayed DDT directly onto an eagle. It arrived through the same accumulating pathway that concentrates mercury in a shark or heavy metals in an ancient predator's flesh. Every meal adding another layer, with nowhere for the compound to go once it settled into fat and tissue. Now here's where it gets interesting, because this isn't a modern industrial pollution problem. Biomagnification happens with natural toxins too, and it happened long before humans built a single factory. Any environment with heavy metals in its soil or water, arsenic, cadmium, lead, feeds that same chain. Grass absorbs it. A grazing animal eats enough grass to accumulate a moderate dose. A predator that eats dozens of those grazing animals over years accumulates the compounded dose of every single one. Ancient hunter-gatherers had no idea what a heavy metal was. They just knew, generation after generation, that eating the animal at the top of the hunt sometimes made people sick in ways eating the animal in the middle never did. That pattern gets remembered. It becomes a rule. Eventually, it becomes a rule nobody can explain anymore, just one everybody still follows. Now, here's the thing. Nobody tells you about the second reason, and it has nothing to do with toxins at all. It's about energy. And it comes down to a piece of ecology called the 10% rule. When energy moves up a food chain, roughly 90% of it is lost at every single step. A plant captures sunlight and stores maybe 1% of that energy as usable tissue. A herbivore eating that plant only converts about 10% of the plant's stored energy into its own body mass. A predator eating that herbivore only converts about 10% of that animal's energy into its own body mass. By the time you reach a top predator, you're looking at an animal that represents an absolutely enormous amount of consumed biomass compressed down into a comparatively tiny, lean, energy-poor body. That's the wild part. A deer, pound for pound, is a far more efficient calorie source than a wolf, because because the deer sits closer to the base of the energy pyramid. A wolf has already spent most of its life burning calories running down prey, and what's left in its body by the time it dies is lean, low in stored fat, and metabolically expensive to have hunted in the first place. Anthropologists studying hunter-gatherer diets through a framework called optimal foraging theory have found exactly this pattern across cultures with zero contact with each other. Humans overwhelmingly target mid-trophic level herbivores because the energy return on investment is dramatically better. Chasing down an actual predator costs enormous risk, enormous effort, and pays out comparatively little at the end. It's a bad trade biologically almost every single time. Here's the thing nobody tells you about why that risk calculation matters so much, though. It's not just wasted effort. Hunting a predator means fighting, at close range, an animal specifically evolved to kill things your exact size. A deer runs from you, a lion does not. So even before you get to what's actually in the meat, hunting predator animals was, for most of human history, a genuinely terrible use of limited calories and a genuinely dangerous use of a hunter's one irreplaceable body. Cultures that developed a blanket aversion to it weren't being squeamish. They were encoding a cost-benefit calculation into a food rule so nobody had to relearn it the hard way every generation. And leanness itself carries a hidden cost that goes beyond simple calorie math. Arctic explorers and northern hunter-gatherer peoples both independently documented a condition sometimes called rabbit starvation, or in clinical terms, protein poisoning. If a person eats large amounts of very lean, very low-fat meat over an extended period, without enough dietary fat or carbohydrate to balance it, the body can't safely process the protein load. The liver has a hard ceiling on how much nitrogen it can convert and excrete per day, and pushing past that ceiling causes headache, diarrhea, low blood pressure, and in extended cases, death from what amounts to metabolic overload. Predator meat, precisely because it sits at a trophic level, where the animal itself has already burned off most of its stored fat chasing prey, is disproportionately likely to be lean in exactly this dangerous way. A deer carries meaningful fat reserves for winter. A wolf, mid-hunt for most of its adult life, often doesn't. Eating an animal that's already metabolically lean compounds the exact energetic problem the 10% rule describes. You're not just getting less energy back, you're getting a macronutrient profile that can actively work against you if it becomes a primary food source. Here's the thing nobody tells you about the taste itself either, because predator meat tastes bad isn't just an opinion, it's measurable chemistry. Herbivores metabolize plant fats in a fairly predictable, consistent way, producing a fairly neutral, consistent fatty acid profile in their flesh. Predators, because their diet is built entirely from other animals, end up with meat carrying higher concentrations of compounds like scatole and certain branched-chain fatty acids, the same general class of molecules responsible for what hunters and butchers describe as a strong, gamey, sometimes almost rancid flavor. It's especially pronounced in older, larger predators that have spent more years accumulating fat from an entirely carnivorous diet. In a very real sense, the taste itself is a warning label, a sensory signal produced by the exact same biological process responsible for biomagnification. You're tasting, quite literally, the compounded diet of everything that animal ever ate. Now, here's where it gets interesting again, because there's a fourth layer, and this one is purely medical: parasites and disease load. Predators carry dramatically higher pathogen loads than herbivores for a simple structural reason. A herbivore's parasites mostly come from plants, soil, and water, a relatively narrow range of exposure. A predator's parasites come from every single animal it has ever eaten, plus its own exposure to soil and water, stacked across an entire lifetime of consuming other consumers. The most well-documented example is trichinellosis, caused by the parasite Trichinella spiralis. It's overwhelmingly associated with carnivore and omnivore meat, pigs, bears, and walruses specifically, because the parasite's entire life cycle depends on being eaten by one meat-eating animal after another. Herbivores essentially never carry it because the parasite has no way to get into an animal that only eats plants. Bear meat in particular is so consistently linked to trichinellosis outbreaks that public health agencies across North America, Europe, and Asia issue standing advisories about it. Multiple documented outbreaks throughout the 20th and 21st centuries have traced directly back to undercooked bear meat, some involving dozens of people at a single shared meal. Walrus meat carries the same risk in Arctic communities for the same underlying reason. Walruses aren't strict herbivores, they're substantial predators of shellfish and other invertebrates, and the parasite load reflects that diet. That's not a coincidence. It's the same underlying mechanism as biomagnification, just applied to living organisms instead of chemical toxins. Whatever is inside the prey ends up inside the predator, concentrated and carried forward. Eat the predator, and you're the next stop on a chain that's been accumulating risk the entire way up. One of the better documented modern cases happened in the early 1980s, when a shared meal of undercooked bear meat at a hunting camp in the United States sickened dozens of people at once with confirmed trichinellosis, some severely enough to require hospitalization. Investigators traced every case back to the same source animal. That's the pattern public health researchers see again and again with carnivore meat specifically, not scattered, isolated illness, but sudden cluster outbreaks tied to a single shared carcass because a heavily infected predator can carry an enormous parasite load concentrated in its muscle tissue, built up meal by meal across its entire life. A herbivore essentially cannot produce that kind of outbreak because the parasite responsible has no pathway into an animal that never eats other animals. Here's the thing nobody tells you about the fifth reason though, and it might be the strangest one because it's not about toxins, energy, or parasites at all. It's about vitamins. In 1912, an Antarctic expedition led by Douglas Mawson set out across the ice with sled dogs pulling their supplies. When the dogs began dying and food ran desperately short, the surviving men, Mawson and Xavier Mertz, ate the dogs to survive, including the livers. Within days, both men developed severe symptoms: peeling skin, intense headaches, vomiting, disorientation. Mertz died. Mawson barely survived, losing the skin on the soles of his feet and much of his hair. For decades, the cause was debated. It's now understood as acute hypervitaminosis A, catastrophic vitamin A poisoning from eating the livers of carnivorous animals. Here's why that happens. Vitamin A is fat-soluble, which means unlike vitamin C or the B vitamins, the body can't simply flush an excess out through urine. It gets stored, specifically in the liver, and it accumulates over an animal's lifetime the same way toxins accumulate through biomagnification. A herbivore's liver holds a comparatively modest amount because its plant-based diet supplies vitamin A in low, manageable doses. A predator's liver is a different story entirely, because meat, particularly the livers of other meat-eating animals, is an extraordinarily concentrated source of vitamin A. Every meal a predator has ever eaten adds another deposit to that store. This is precisely why polar bear liver carries one of the most famous, most consistently documented food warnings in the entire Arctic. Inuit communities have known for generations, passed down explicitly and without ambiguity, that polar bear liver is dangerous to eat. A single serving can contain vitamin A levels literally hundreds of times higher than the recommended daily amount for a human adult. Early European explorers who ignored this guidance, sometimes dismissing it as folklore rather than food science, documented severe poisoning in their own expedition journals repeatedly across multiple centuries of Arctic exploration. Symptoms match almost exactly what happened to Mawson and Mertz: skin peeling off in sheets, blinding headaches, nausea, disorientation, and in severe cases, death. That's the wild part. This wasn't guesswork. Arctic peoples had identified, tested, and transmitted a precise, accurate piece of biochemistry through oral tradition alone, centuries before anyone understood what vitamin A even was, let alone that it was fat-soluble and bioaccumulative. The rule, never eat the liver of a predator, turns out to be extremely specifically correct, and it's correct for exactly the same underlying reason biomagnification and trichinellosis are. Predators concentrate what passes through them, and the parts of their bodies that do the concentrating, especially the liver, become dramatically more dangerous than the same organ in a herbivore. Now put all 5 of these reasons together, and a genuinely coherent picture forms. Biomagnification means predator flesh carries a compounded chemical burden that herbivore flesh simply doesn't. The 10% rule, and the leanness that comes with it, means hunting a predator is, on average, an objectively worse energetic trade than hunting the animals a step or two lower on the food chain. And eating that predator meat can strain the body's own protein processing limits. Elevated pathogen and parasite loads mean predator meat carries meaningfully higher disease risk. And fat-soluble vitamin accumulation, especially in organs like the liver, means specific parts of a predator's body can become actively, sometimes fatally, toxic in ways no herbivore's equivalent organ ever is. None of these 5 mechanisms required a single human to understand chemistry, ecology, parasitology, or biochemistry. They only required humans to notice, repeatedly across enough generations, that eating certain animals sometimes ended in sickness or death, while eating other animals almost never did. That pattern got encoded the same way most deep, near-universal food taboos get encoded, not as an explained scientific principle, but as an inherited rule, stripped of its original reasoning, carried forward because the groups who ignored it simply didn't survive to pass their habits on as often as the groups who obeyed it. You can actually see the residue of this logic hardened directly into some of the world's oldest formal dietary codes. Kosher dietary law explicitly excludes predatory birds and land animals that hunt other animals, permitting cud-chewing herbivores with split hooves instead. Halal dietary law follows a closely related structure, explicitly prohibiting animals that hunt using fangs or talons. These aren't arbitrary categories invented for symbolic reasons alone. They map, with striking precision, onto exactly the line biomagnification, trophic energy loss, parasite load, and vitamin accumulation would predict. The animals excluded are, overwhelmingly, the animals sitting highest on the food chain. You can find versions of the same underlying pattern well outside those two specific traditions too. Traditional dietary guidance across a wide range of unrelated cultures, from parts of East Asia to the Arctic to sub-Saharan Africa, singles out organ meats and predator flesh for special caution far more consistently than it singles out muscle meat from grazing animals. Anthropologists studying food taboos across hundreds of documented societies have noted the same directional bias repeatedly. Restrictions cluster overwhelmingly around carnivores, scavengers, and organ tissue, and almost never around herbivores eaten as plain muscle meat. Different continents, different belief systems, different explanations offered for the rule, and yet the underlying category being avoided keeps landing in the exact same biological place. So here's the actual answer to the question. We don't avoid predator meat because of one clean, single reason. We avoid it because evolution and cultural transmission stacked 5 separate, independently discovered hazards on top of each other, and every one of them points the same direction. Toxins concentrate upward. Energy gets wasted going after animals that are already lean and hard-won, and that same leanness can turn the meat itself into a metabolic burden. Parasites accumulate through every link of a predator's diet, and fat-soluble vitamins build up in organs like the liver until they cross from nutrient into poison. So picture it again. You're standing over a fresh kill, starving, staring at a piece of meat from an animal that spent its entire life eating other animals. Every instinct says eat. But underneath that meat is a quiet, compounded history. Every toxin its prey ever absorbed, every calorie it burned catching that prey, every parasite carried forward from 100 earlier meals, every fat-soluble vitamin stored and never flushed out. None of it is visible. None of it smells wrong or looks wrong. And for tens of thousands of years, across cultures that never once spoke to each other, humans arrived at exactly the same conclusion anyway. Not because they understood biomagnification, or the 10% rule, or hypervitaminosis A, because enough of the people who ignored that instinct simply didn't live long enough to explain why.